Good afternoon and welcome to today's lecture covering the brain. I just want to add that, just to be clear, I'm not doing this because there's going to be any more tests or evaluations or assessments for the rest of the semester. I'm doing this because it was brought to my attention that your class didn't cover this section, and it's really important that you do cover it, just in terms of having a good base in as an intro to psychology class. So we're going to cover this now. It might be a little bit longer, bear with me, but we'll get through this, okay? So again, no, this is up to you guys if you want to read. I strongly recommend it, but there's no pressure or responsibility to do that. Okay, so as I said, today we'll be covering the brain. As usual, there's a YouTube video at the bottom of this slide, just to give you a little bit of an introduction or a taster of what you're going to see in this chapter. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to cover older brain structures, which include the tools of discovery, having our head examined, the brain stem, the thalamus and the reticular formation, the cerebellum, and the limbic system. We're also going to look at the cerebral cortex, so looking at structure of the cortex, functions of the cortex, and the brain's plasticity. And then finally, our divided brain. So that would be focused into splitting the brain and looking at the right and left differences in the intact brain. Okay, so is it possible to understand the brain? A quote there from Emerson M. Pugh. So in a work accident, the case of Phineas Gage, in a work accident, a metal rod shot up through Phineas Gage's skull, destroying his eye and part of his frontal lobe. So he was working on a railroad, and there was an explosion that went off that sent the rod through his brain. So after healing, he was rude, odd, irritable, and unpredictable. So his personality or character changed. Possible explanation for the change in personality. Damage to his frontal lobes hurt his ability to inhibit emotions and impulses. So, the founder of phrenology, Franz Joseph Gall, is pioneer in the study of the localization and mental functions in the brain. External size and shape of the brain equals the personality and mental faculties of the brain, according to him. The mind is a collection of independent entities housed within the brain. That is a quote from Franz Joseph Gall. So just to add, phrenology pseudoscience primarily focused on measurements of the human skull based on the concept that the brain is the organ of the mind, and that certain brain areas have localized specific functions or modules. So monitoring activity in the brain. Tools to read electrical, metabolic, and magnetic activity in the brain. So let's take a look at that. You have an EEG, which is an electroencephalogram. You have an MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging. There's PET, which is positron emission tomography, and then an fMRI, which is a functional MRI. So just to add to that, at the bottom of the slide, the oldest method of studying the brain involved observing the effects of the brain, observing the effects of brain diseases and injuries through case studies. Nowadays, powerful techniques now reveal brain structures and activities in the living brain. And then there's a video there that kind of explains how that's done. An EEG, or an electroencephalogram, is a recording of the electrical waves sweeping across the brain surface. An EEG is useful in studying seizures and sleep, and this is something that we briefly covered before when we looked at the chapters on sleep. So an EEG uses electrodes placed on the scalp. One way is to surgically lesion and electrically stimulate specific brain areas so we can see how the brain functions. A brain lesion is a naturally or experimentally caused destruction of brain tissue. So a PET scan. PET scan allows us to see what part of the brain is active by tracing where a radioactive form of glucose goes while the brain performs a given task. So with a PET scan, we can look inside the brain to see its activity. An MRI. So, magnetic resonancing imaging makes images from signals produced by brain tissue after magnetics align the spin of atoms. The arrows below show ventricular enlargement in a schizophrenic patient. So MRIs are also used not just over the brain, but to examine different parts of the body. So I would imagine, in particular, the athletes in the class, but anybody who's suffered a major injury, you may have had an MRI performed on that area where the injury was to see some of the damage. So the X-rays would normally look at any structural damage to the bones of the skeleton, whereas the MRIs would look at some of the damage in terms of to the surrounding tissue, oftentimes ligaments, tendons, and muscles. Okay. And an MRI can also give you some structural information as well with bones. fMRI, functional MRI, reveals brain activity and functions rather than structures. Functional MRI compares successive MRI images taken a split second apart and shows changes in the level of oxygen and blood flow in the brain. The brain, older brain structures. Our tour of the brain begins with parts of the human brain found also in simpler animals. These parts generally deal with less complex functions. So you have the brainstem, which is made up of the pons and the medulla, the thalamus, the reticular formation, the cerebellum, and the limbic system. So the brainstem, which includes the pons and the medulla, you'll see here on this slide an image of where that is in the brain and what the different parts that make up the brainstem. We'll just move along, and there is a YouTube video that goes along with this slide. Here, we'll just focus a bit on the brainstem area particularly. So this covers all the structures that we just saw in the previous slide, and then here specifically the brainstem with the pons and the medulla. So taking a closer look at that. The medulla controls the most basic functions such as heartbeat and breathing. Someone with total brain damage above the medulla can still breathe independently, but someone with brain damage in this area cannot. Now, looking at the thalamus. The thalamus is the sensory switchboard or router. Located on the top of the brainstem, it directs messages to the sensory receiving areas in the cortex and transmits replies to the cerebellum and to the medulla. The messages cross over from one side of the body to the opposite side of the brain, as you see with the picture on the bottom left, labeled the crossover. Just to add, at the top of the brainstem, we have the thalamus, the brain sensory router. So this area receives information from all the senses except for smell, and it sends it to higher brain regions to deal with seeing, hearing, tasting, and touching. The reticular net-like formation, with an image displaying where it is. Just a moment, guys. Sorry about that. Let's get back to business. Oops. Sorry about that. Important phone calls. Okay, let's get back to task. So the reticular formation is a nerve network in the brainstem. It enables alertness, so arousal. Stimulating this makes us wide awake. It also filters incoming sensory information and relays it to other brain areas. So just to add a little bit, the reticular formation is an important area that controls arousal. The structure of the reticular formation, this structure is a network of neurons that branches from the spinal cord up to the thalamus. And then there's a little bit more information speaking about an experiment that was done to a cat that allowed us to discover a little bit about the functioning of the reticular formation. I'll let you guys read that. The cerebellum, so the little brain. The cerebellum helps coordinate voluntary movements such as playing sports or playing a sport. The cerebellum has many other functions, including enabling nonverbal learning and memory. So there's a YouTube video that's associated with this slide, and just to add, the cerebellum is located in two parts, behind the pons and below the back of the brain. The cerebellum is attached to the rear of the brainstem and coordinates movement, output, and balance, and helps process sensory information. Other functions involve helping us judge time, modulate our emotions, and discriminate sounds and textures. The cerebellum is also the area where implicit memories and conditioning are stored. It also helps us judge time. So as I mentioned before, it helps us judge time, modulate emotions, and integrate multiple sources of sensory input. Okay. The limbic border system. So the limbic system coordinates emotions such as fear and aggression, basic drives such as hunger and sex, and the formation of episodic memories. So within the limbic system, there's the hippocampus, the seahorse, which is illustrated in the picture on the right, which processes conscious episodic memories and works with the amygdala to form emotionally charged memories. The amygdala, or almond, consists of two lima bean-sized neural clusters, helps process emotions, especially fear and aggression. And as usual, again, the YouTube video at the bottom for you guys to check out. The amygdala, enabling two different responses to threat. The electrical stimulation of one area of a cat's amygdala provokes aggressive reactions. If you stimulate a different part of the amygdala and put the cat in a cage with a mouse, the cat will cower in terror. Or so some of you may have heard the flight or fight response. So the hypothalamus lies below, implicated by the first part, hippo, the thalamus. Regulates body temperature and ensures adequate food and water intake, allowing for homeostasis, and is involved in the sex drive. Directs the endocrine system via messages to the pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus as a reward center as well. So there's a depiction of a rat down here, and it explains why the rat wanted to go to the other side. So this is a summary of the structures that we've seen. So illustrations showing exactly where they are, and then a small definition or explanation of what their functioning is or what they control within our bodies. The cerebral cortex. So it's made up of over 300 billion synaptic connections. And as you see, the brain has a left and right hemispheres. Each brain hemisphere, there's two, divided into 4 lobes that are separated by prominent fissures. These are the frontal lobe, so occupies the forehead area, the parietal lobe, which is top and near the back of our heads, the occipital lobe, which is really in the back, and then the temporal lobe, which is on the side. Okay, so frontal lobes, parietal lobes, occipital lobes, and temporal lobes. So frontal lobes are involved in speaking and muscle movements and in making plans and judgments. Parietal lobes include the sensory cortex. Occipital lobes include the visual areas, and they receive visual information from the opposite visual field, and temporal lobes, which include the auditory processing areas. So functions of the brain, the motor and sensory strips. The motor cortex is the area at the rear of the frontal lobes that control voluntary movements. The sensory cortex, or parietal cortex, receives information from skin surface and sense organs. And here you have a diagram, you have an illustration at the bottom that depicts that. And there's some extra points at the bottom of this slide. So the motor cortex, an arch-shaped region at the rear of the frontal lobes, controls voluntary muscle movements on the opposite side of the body. Body parts requiring the most precise control occupy the greatest amount of the cortical space. The sensory cortex is a region at the front of the parietal lobes, registers and processes body sensations. The most sensitive body parts require the largest amount of space in the sensory cortex. So, homunculus, distorted scale model of a human drawn or sculpted to reflect the relative space human body parts occupy on the somatosensory cortex, so sensory homunculus, and the motor cortex, motor homunculus. Sensory functions of the cortex. So you have the auditory cortex and visual cortex in this picture here on the right. The sensory strip deals with information from touch stimuli. The occipital lobe deals with visual information. The auditory information is sent to the temporal lobe. Visual cortex. This functional MRI scan shows increased activity in the visual cortex when a person looks at a photograph. Association function of the cortex. More intelligent animals have increased uncommitted or association areas of the cortex. Neurons in these areas integrate information. So you see scale of more developed, scale of more developed and more intelligent animals going from a rat to a cat, chimpanzee, and then human. Language, specialization, and integration. So here's a picture of the brain areas involved in language processing. You have the motor cortex, where words are pronounced, Broca's area, which controls speech muscles via the motor cortex, Wernicke's area, which interprets auditory code. You have the visual cortex, which receives written word as visual stimulation, and the angular gyrus, which transforms visual representations into an auditory code. So if we take a look at each, first, aphasia, impairment of language, usually caused by left hemisphere damage, either to Broca's area or Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area controls language reception, usually in the left temporal lobe, involved in language comprehension and expression, where we formulate the plan. Broca's area controls language expression. An area of the frontal lobe, and is usually in the left hemisphere, directs muscle movements involved in speech, where the plan is executed. And there's a series of videos at the bottom, YouTube videos talking about TED Talks, and explain a bit more about this section. Okay, specialization and integration. Brain activity when hearing, seeing, and speaking words. So you have illustration A, we're hearing words, auditory cortex and Wernicke's area, seeing words, and the visual cortex and angular gyrus are stimulated, and then speaking words where Broca's area and the motor cortex are showing activity. Plasticity, the brain is adaptable. So if the brain is damaged, especially in the general association areas of the cortex, what happens? The brain does not repair damaged neurons, but it can restore some functions. It can form new connections, reorganize, reassign brain areas to new functions. Some neurogenesis, production of new brain cells, helps rebuild. And this is explained by the story of a 6-year-old, which is depicted here in this picture. Let's continue along. Splitting the brain, a procedure in which the two hemispheres of the brain are isolated by cutting the connecting fibers, mainly those of the corpus callosum, between them, separating the hemispheres. Factors to keep in mind. Each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body and is aware of the visual field on that opposite side. Without the corpus callosum, the halves of the body and the halves of the visual field do not work together. Only the left half of the brain has enough verbal ability to express it. Split visual field. Each hemisphere perceives the half of the view in front of you that goes with the half of the body that is controlled by that hemisphere. And you'll see a picture here on the right that just shows that a bit. Divided awareness in the split brain. Try to explain the following result. So I'll let you guys take a look at that. And then also, if you want, there's a video at the bottom, another YouTube video that goes along with this slide. Divided brain in action. So, talent. People are able to follow 2 instructions and draw 2 different shapes simultaneously. Can't do that. Drawback. People can be frustrated that the right and left sides do different things. Our 2 hemispheres, so the left and the right. Lateralization, going to one side. The two hemispheres serve some different functions. How do we know about these differences? The brain damage studies revealed many functions of the left hemisphere. Brain scans and split brain studies show more about the functions of the two hemispheres and how they coordinate with each other. Just to add, brain scan studies show normal individuals engage their right brain when completing a perceptual task and their left brain when carrying out a linguistic task. However, many functions of the two hemispheres overlap. Right-left hemisphere differences. So you have the left and the right hemisphere here. Left hemisphere has with it thoughts and logic, language, so words and definition, and pieces and detail. Whereas right hemisphere has feelings and intuition, language, but specifically on tone, inflection, and context, and then wholes, including the self. So mnemonics can help you study. And we've seen this before as well in terms of what we covered when we were looking at memory. And that concludes the lecture for today. So that concludes the lecture for today. That also concludes this is the last lecture for this course. So again, thank you very much for your time and your patience throughout the semester. I know it's been trying for you guys as you've gone through a number of teachers as well as situations with learning at home and learning online. I have to say I'm really happy with you guys being kind with me, and then also as well, it says a lot about your guys and your resilience to be able to deal with all these changes throughout this year. Stay happy, stay safe, stay healthy. Bye, guys.